Is anyone in here a really early riser? Like you love getting up before 6 a.m.? Okay, what about before 5 a.m.? Okay, anyone like awake in the 4 o'clock hour sometimes? Yeah, kids for sure. I have, in these past 8 months, found myself awake so much more often at 4 a.m., and I can't say that I'm a fan. I'm a firm believer that only the Lord should be awake before 6 a.m., so, here we are. This has nothing to do with the homily, by the way. I just have been thinking about it at 4 a.m. this morning and thought, this might be a little fun thing to get us laughing before we start. So anyway, here we are. Hi, I'm, as it probably said at one point, I'm the pastor's husband. I'm Maggie's husband, also a parishioner here at Sacred Grace. And I have the wonderful honor of preaching this morning and walking through God's Word together. And I think it's a little bit ironic that I'm up here continuing our series on leadership. Not because I don't believe in leadership, not because I'm not a leader myself, but I have a strange and inordinate resistance to all kinds of leadership conversations. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. I don't know if it's because I've just been in them constantly, if it's because I've read so many books that say a lot of the same thing, if it's because I work with high school students and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who all of them are trying to be Sigma. And if you don't know what Sigma means, good for you. And it just means Alpha, because why use one Greek letter when you can use two to mean the same thing? So it's super fun. It doesn't make sense. But there's this like huge push towards leadership constantly, it feels like, in our environment, or at least in the environments that I'm in. And regardless, I don't love talking about it, but I do think it's important. But I think so often in Christian cultures, we get it wrong in a lot of ways. Not because we're trying to follow Jesus, but because we so often look elsewhere. We look to the businesses, we look to the CEOs, we look to what the rest of our culture is doing to try to figure out, well, what does good leadership looks like? Now, I'm not trying to paint a dichotomy between like Christians and the world. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I do think the Christian view of leadership is starkly different to any other worldview's take on leadership for a number of reasons. And so often, instead of looking there, we go to the Bible, which is good when we do it right. And I think a lot of times we look at the Bible and we try to, we either try to shoehorn biblical characters into our modern context or raise them up to be the pinnacles of how we ought to strive to lead, which so often they are, and so often they are not at the same time. And so as we get into the stories that we're going to look at this morning, as we get into the patriarchs, we are going to look at them and see what can we learn from this leadership or from their leadership. And so if you caught this contradiction in the last two sentences, stick with me. Don't write me off right away. We're going to kind of engage with this tension because while these people, we can learn from them so powerfully, they're also so broken, just as we are. So with that in mind, we're going to jump in and we're going to explore the first three, some people include Joseph in this, but the first three patriarchs of the faith, the fathers of the faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're the first three generations of a specific family that God chooses to work through to bring about his redemption. God calls each one of them and renews his covenant with them. And so we're just going to pop into each of these stories. By no means could we read the entirety of all three of these patriarchs in one morning. Or we could, but there's community lunch and people got to get snacky. So we're not going to do that. Instead, we're just going to pop in and see what we can learn from them while also navigating this tension of, okay, these are broken and fallible and finite people just as we are, and yet also often revered as heroes of the faith. So let's start with Abraham. So his story begins actually with his father, but we're not going to get into that. Abraham gets called by God to go to the land of Canaan. God is leading him to something new, and Abraham leaves everything in order to follow God into this new place. And so last week, Nathan highlighted these two crucial elements or characteristics of leadership: humility and conviction. And we're going to look at these two aspects because I think they're really brilliant out of First Peter, and we're going to see how they play out in each of these stories, starting with Abraham. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit in Abraham's story. God has already promised him three things in the initial covenant. He'd make his name great, so basically, and give him a lot of descendants. He's going to give him a land. And the third one, which often gets forgotten, and yet it's the most important one, in my opinion, through Abraham and his family, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. So we're about 20 years after the call of Abraham. Abraham was called around 70, so we're now at about 90. Anyone 90 in here? I didn't think so. But imagine you are, and this is the story. In Genesis 18, if you have your Bible, go ahead and open it up and follow along. It's really fun. But in Genesis 18, there's two kind of unique stories. Abraham is living in the land where God called him to. And there are these three visitors who come to visit him. Now, initially, we're not quite sure who these three visitors are, but later in the story, at least one of them is revealed to be divine, to be God. Maybe the other two are angels. We're not entirely sure. That's not the most important thing. But when Abraham sees these visitors, he runs out to them, and he greets them. And then he invites them back into his tent, and he offers them unbelievable hospitality. He engages in a practice called haknasat orchim, which, yes, be impressed. That's the only reason I said that. I'm just kidding. This leader needs humility. So anyway, this practice, I do highlight it because of its importance. It's not just normal hospitality. It's an extreme form of hospitality that some people still practice today. It takes it a step further, not just getting them what they need while they're here, but also ensuring that they have what they need and make it to their next destination safely as well. So there's this extreme hospitality. And so he meets them, and he engages with them. He provides food, water, everything that they need. Now, offering hospitality is incredibly humbling. You might be inviting people into your space. You might, as many of us, or at least my family historically has done, you get everything clean before you invite people over. But then, depending on the people, sometimes they're still a little bit judgy. But it's very vulnerable to invite people into that space and to offer them something. Maybe you make a meal and then you find out, oh, they don't eat that thing. And you're like, oh, no. But it's incredibly humbling action. You have to put yourself essentially in the role of a servant and care for others. You're not thinking about yourself in these moments. You're thinking about your guests. And that's what Abraham is doing. And so Abraham offers this hospitality, and later on it reveals that one of them is divine, is God. And I think there's the first thing that we can take away from this in Abraham's leadership is, should leaders offer hospitality, or should they be hospitable? And I think yes. And you might be thinking, like, you're just pulling this random story and saying, oh, all leaders should be hospitable. Yes, I am doing that. Good catch. But also, I think it's important because it's reflective of humility. Good leaders who are following God, who are following the biblical example, show extreme care and concern for those whom they are leading. And honestly, this is convicting for me because I work with high school students and all of my patience goes to being a dad. And so I get into the class and I'm like, oh my gosh, please learn how to read a sentence. For the love. I love you all so much and you're killing me. But it's convicting for me because they have been entrusted in my care and I am, as their teacher, in a sense, a leader of them. And so I need to be concerned with how am I caring for them? How am I treating them? Am I creating an environment where I am focused on them and not the other way around? And I think good leadership does that. But the story doesn't end there. It actually continues. And arguably, it's as a result of this hospitality that Abraham shows that as the visitors are getting ready to leave, we're told of a really fascinating conversation between them that's going to lead to an interaction with Abraham. So God, personified here, is debating on bringing Abraham into the conversation about what to do with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe you're familiar with the story, maybe you're not. It's weird. You can read along in Genesis 18, but here's how essentially it goes. There's an outcry of some sort that has come to God. their sin is so grievous that God is going to see what is actually going on, though God is omnipotent, so he's all-knowing. Or no, yes, omnipotent. Omniscient, thank you, see? 4 a.m. doesn't do one good. God is omniscient, so he's all-knowing, so this is mostly for Abraham and the reader's sake. But the grievousness, the sin, is argued that it's injustice and oppression that's going on in these two cities. That is the outcry that has made it to the ears of God, which makes sense because the two things that make God the most angry throughout the Bible are idolatry and injustice. And so here, if there's this huge swath of injustice going on, it makes sense that this outcry has reached the ears of God and God is going to see about it, what needs to be done. And so Abraham stands before the Lord and starts to make a case against their destruction because he's like, oh man, God's going to go destroy them. And so he says to God, will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous and the wicked alike. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? Abraham is speaking to the Lord. And he's essentially arguing that, God, are you unjust? Are you going to wipe away everything? That doesn't seem like you. Now, I'm not one to think that God is constantly testing his people, but this is a fascinating interaction. Because in it, Abraham is showing his conviction. But at the same time, I don't think he's like challenging God of like, hey, you are this, why aren't you being just? Instead, I was talking with a coworker this week about this story, and he kind of painted it in the picture of a parent with a child, kind of bargaining with them a little bit. With the idea being, parents, maybe you have experienced this. I have not because my kid doesn't bargain yet. But the idea being like you're at the dinner table or whatever food table you're at, and you're trying to get them to eat a little bit more. And you're like, okay, 5 more bites. And then your kid comes back to you and you're like, but what about 2 big bites? And you're like, okay, 2 big bites. We can do that. And they're like, what about 3 small bites? And you kind of have this back and forth. But at the end of the day, as the parent, you are probably cool with it because the ultimate goal is to get them to do what? To eat. You want them to eat more. And so I wonder, as I was reading this week, I wonder if God isn't smirking a little bit. Because Abraham, in his challenge here, in his saying, wait, hold on, God. Are you going to wipe everybody out? I wonder if God isn't smiling because the person that he chose to bring about the redemption of the world through this family is once again starting to get it. He's starting to understand what it means to be a leader, but also what it means to follow this God. Because now his character, this challenging of, hey, wait, that's injustice. God, I thought you were a just God. Is this not more injustice? Now he's in line with what God is saying. And so God does bargain with him. And he's like, yes, you're getting it, Abraham. I am not a God of injustice. And you had the conviction to call this out to God, God's self. And so I think that is one of the next things that we can learn from the story of Abraham. In this brief pop-in, leaders should humbly care for those who are entrusted to them with great dedication. And leaders should also be willing to speak up against injustice for the sake of others. Because Abraham doesn't live in Sodom and Gomorrah, but his family does. Lot does. I'm not going to go into that for the sake of time, but go read the story. It's whack, but so cool. But he's speaking up to the God of justice about a perceived injustice for the sake of others. And I think that's what leaders ought to do as well. I don't think it gets any more courageous than that. I don't think it gets any more not convicted than that. I don't know if there's a greater conviction than that. So Abraham's story continues, and as many of you probably know, years later, God's promise that he would have a son is fulfilled. Isaac is born, and Isaac learns the ways of his father and the ways of God, though and sometimes following too closely in Abraham's footsteps. But there's this really fascinating story in Genesis chapter 26. So you're welcome to follow along, but here's essentially how it goes. Isaac is now living in the land of Canaan. Abraham and Sarah at that point have passed. His parents are passed. He has kids of his own, and he has been trying to follow the ways of God. And the Philistines, this group of people, are also living in the same area. And there is a previous conflict at the start of 26 where Isaac is following a little too closely in Abraham's footsteps, so you can read that later on your own. But it's going to come up again. There's a conflict with the king of the Philistines, Abimelech. And so long story short, backstory, Abraham built a bunch of wells. Fun fact. And during Isaac's lifetime, there was once again, as there was in Abraham's lifetime, a severe famine in the land. Abraham went down to Egypt. Isaac stays. And as a result of Isaac staying during this famine, God blesses him tremendously. See verse 12. 100-fold is what the crop says. And so because of that, because of his wealth, this abundance of produce, this abundance of resources that he gains as a result of staying in the land, even in the midst of this famine, the Philistines envied him. And they go around to all of the wells that Abraham had dug, and they filled them in. Straight up out of spite. For no good reason, because water in that region and at that time is super scarce. And then, insult to injury, the king, Abimelech, goes to Isaac and basically says, hey, you've become too powerful. You got to scoot. Go on. And Isaac gets. He goes on. And so he moves away. He's like, okay, that's fine. He moves. He goes to another area and he begins to reopen a well that had been stopped up. And his servants finish digging this well, but then, plot twist, there are these shepherds, these herders, these Philistine herders, they come in and they argue, they're like, hey, that water's ours. And they quarrel about it. So what does Isaac do? He punches them right in the mouth. Look at verse 18. No, I'm just kidding. That's not in there. He doesn't do that. He doesn't fight back with them. He doesn't even argue with them. All the story tells us is that he moves on. So he goes to another area in the next verses and once more digs a well. But again, the people come in and they quarrel with him. And Isaac, once again, doesn't respond. Or at least we're not told how he responds, except for the fact that he moves on yet again. And wouldn't you know it, third time's the charm. He goes, digs another well, and no one comes to quarrel. Fun fact, this is where third time's the charm originated. No, it's not. I probably shouldn't lie to you all. But you're just checking, making sure you guys are listening. That's not where it comes from. I have no idea where it comes from, so ask somebody smarter than I. So there's a lot to unpack here with this Isaac story, but I want to focus on first two things. First, right after the story of the wells, God appears to Isaac and reaffirms his covenant with him. The same covenant that he established with Abraham, now reestablished and establishing Isaac as the new patriarch, God affirms this covenant. The second thing that happens right after that covenant is affirmed is that the king of the Philistines, Abimelech, who initially kicked him out, comes to him. And Isaac's like, what are you doing? You kicked me out. Like, what do you want? And he essentially recognizes that the Lord is with Isaac. And as a result, he wants to establish a covenant with him, an agreement. And they do. The reason I highlight these two conclusions of the story is because they reveal an important quality, I think, that we can glean about leadership. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. In other words, leaders with humility and conviction, like Isaac does, shouldn't always fight for their rights. And I know this might be a controversial and a countercultural statement, and I'm going to unpack it a little bit. But godly leaders need to be willing to suffer injustice without retribution, without retaliation, for the greater good. Or rather, sometimes leadership means having the conviction to suffer injustice for the sake of long-term benefits or long-term blessings. Because it's as a result of Isaac's sacrifice, the result of him not fighting for the wells that he had every right to, his father dug those wells, that God worked through him and ended up resulting in the blessing of Abimelech. Because if you remember, the third component of the covenant that God makes with Abraham is that all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. And this is an instance where we see that blessing come to pass, but not as a result of what we might expect. This is a result of injustice, arguably, suffered willingly for the sake of others. The greater good is that God recognizes Isaac, that he has the humility and conviction not to retaliate. And as a result, he blesses Isaac and works through him. And as a result of that, because Isaac doesn't stir up greater conflict with the Philistine herders, because he doesn't quarrel with them, the king comes to him in recognition of Yahweh, in recognition of the Lord. And this is one of the greatest areas that I struggle with, if I'm honest. I mean, I don't necessarily always fight for my rights, but boy, do I love being right and having the right to be right. And this comes up with students, this comes up in conversations, and I have to constantly pray against this, that I don't need to be right all the time. And that is really, really difficult. And I think this is also one of the areas that we as a culture, as Americans, struggle the most. We are quarrelsome. Constantly quarrelsome. We quarrel over our rights. And I'm not saying that rights are bad, by no means. But as I read this story, I wonder if we need to learn to become more comfortable sacrificing our rights for the sake of others, which I know is counter-American culture. But if the Bible tells us anything, it is central to the culture of God's kingdom. And I know this doesn't work out perfectly in all situations, but I wonder if we can learn from this personally as leaders, if we can enact this. The final story. It doesn't end there. We're going to explore briefly Jacob's life. Now, Jacob, though he was a twin with Esau, son of Isaac, he was the second born. Now, culturally, this was super significant. It meant that Esau received the majority of the inheritance, the blessing, and the responsibility. And the family leadership would pass on to him. Well, Esau, he seemed to detest this status. His conviction was that this sucks. I do not want this. I'm not going to do this. Jacob, on the other hand, envied the status of the firstborn. He had so much conviction. He's like, this is going to be mine. I want this. And just as a little aside, his name essentially means deceiver. Future parents in the room, don't do this. Don't set your kid up for failure in this way, being like, oh, little deceiver, how cute, hello. That's going to be your life. It doesn't work out well for him, so don't do that. But anyway, I digress. Jacob grows up, and 2 times his conviction drives him to steal. He first deceives his brother into selling him the birthright. Then, near the end of Isaac's life, he deceives him into giving Jacob the blessing, this familial patriarchal blessing that had huge significance that was due to Esau. But he kills a goat and glues it on himself so he looks hairy, kind of like Esau. It's a whole thing. And he deceives his father and receives both components that were due to Esau as the firstborn. He then inherits him himself. Now, his deception doesn't end there. It actually happens to him. He sees pretty girl, as we say in our class, and then works for 7 years for a pretty girl. And then on the wedding night, wine is flowing. And, oh no, I guess I married a sister of girl and not girl that I wanted to marry. The old switcheroo. Don't you hate it when that happens? Anyone? Don't raise your hand to that. So like he gets deceived and then he does it again. So his whole life he has such strong convictions, but his identity, it plays out. His convictions are leading him in the wrong way. They're leading him to be deceptive. They're leading him to constantly strive and grasp for that which he does not have. And to do so at the detriment of so many relationships, the so many people, and all different types of stuff. And throughout his life, we see that he essentially has little to almost no humility. So here we have a leader with great conviction, a future patriarch, but no humility. And it does not work out well for him. Until he's going home. Isaac has passed and he's going to return to his family. But that means he's going to return to seeing his brother. And if you stole pretty much the two most important things in your family from your brother's probably not going to be super stoked about that. So Jacob initially flees because he's afraid for his life because Esau's going to kill him. So he's getting ready to go back. And he sends his family across first, maybe to appease Esau, be like, please, look at all my family. Don't hurt me. Or who knows, there's some other reasons that biblical scholars in the room are probably shaking their heads at me about. But the point is, he sends them over first, and he stays behind. And that night, he has this fascinating interaction where this person, arguably God, appears before him. And Jacob wants a blessing. He once again sees in some way that this person has power, sees that he's got conviction, and so he strives after that to get it. So he wrestles with him. He's like, I won't let go until you bless me. And the guy's like, okay. Not exactly. You can read it in Genesis 32 and following. But they're neck and neck. Nobody's giving an inch. And so eventually, Jacob's hip gets wrenched. And he's impaired. He is humbled in this moment. He is overpowered and he is humbled. And I think that this ends up being the major turning point in Jacob's life. He learns what humility looks like, arguably forcefully, but this changes him drastically. In the rest of his interactions with Esau, he humbly presents himself as a servant. And Esau's like totally chill, by the way. He's like, why are you doing all this stuff? Like, we're cool, brothers. But it is as a result of this change, this recognition of the need and expression of humility, that God, in Genesis 35, reaffirms the covenant, the promise extended to Abraham and Isaac, now to Jacob. Jacob, I think, in this moment has learned not just how to lead with both conviction and humility, but he's also learned how to follow. Which truly is the real conclusion for all of us. That as we read and learn from the Bible of what leadership looks like, followership is primary. And we're going to talk about this later in this series, but if we want to know how to lead well as Christians, we need to learn how to follow well. God doesn't need people who are necessarily great at inspiring those around them. God doesn't need articulate speakers. That's why I'm up here. Or popular figures. God needs people who will trust God. People who will learn what it means to be a sheep in the flock and follow the voice of the shepherd. Which is why Hebrews 11 talks about these heroes of the faith. Starting in verse 17, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. Whole different story. We can unpack that later. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." And Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. The faith is this incredible trust and allegiance in God. All three of these patriarchs had all kinds of messed up stories. They did things incredibly wrong numerous times. And yet, throughout all of it, throughout the long-suffering journey that God put up with these chosen people, they learned what it meant to follow. Abraham learned what it meant to speak out against injustice, to offer hospitality. Isaac learned what it meant to maybe sacrifice and suffer injustice your own self for the sake of others. Jacob learned what it meant to be a humble leader and not one constantly striving after what he doesn't have. And that ultimately is our goal. We need to learn how to follow God. That's the takeaway from these stories. How did these people end up following God? How did they learn to follow God to become more like him? Because as leaders, if we are not following God, if we are not following the true shepherd, we're not going to lead well. At least we're not going to lead in line with God. Would you pray with me? Lord, thank you for these stories. Thank you for the reality that these individuals are just as fallen as we are. And though, Lord, through your grace and mercy, they figured it out at different points and along the way, I pray and ask that you would help us figure it out along the way. Would you help us to follow you, to trust in you, even into the places that seem dark and unknown, and go counter to everything that we want to, our comfort, our cultural understandings. But God, would you help us learn from you? And so for those of us who are leading in here in any capacity, God, would you help us learn how to be a follower? Our world is constantly pushing people to be leaders, but we need to first learn how to be followers of you. And so would you help us, oh God? Would you have mercy on us for when we do it wrong? Would you be gracious to us when we harm others as a result of our leadership instead of seeking their good? Would you help us find a balance between humility and conviction that is honoring to you and in line with your character? Would you help us speak out against injustice for the sake of others and be willing to suffer it for the sake of others as well? Lead us, oh God. We need you because we are really bad at it without you. Thank you for loving us, Lord. I pray this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.